Dallas, I don't feel too well.
This is episode 6 of Dictate, Dissect, and Discuss. Today we are back in the blog sphere, or should I say the former blog sphere, and reading an excerpt from Michael Parenti's Dirty Truths. This is pages 172 to 191 in the original 1996 printing. The JFK Assassination 2. Conspiracy Phobia on the Left. And as you can see on screen, this actually starts with my second highlight, but I will read the first highlight as a preface to this article so you get a bit of background. And the author of the blog actually had a bit of an introduction in the beginning explaining their thoughts and how they came to understand and take note of Parenti's own struggles with the left, conspiracy phobia, and the JFK assassination. So I will read that to give you some background, and then we'll get into it. One. Parenti's writing affirms for me a disturbing conclusion at which I had already arrived some time ago, that the adamant, knee-jerk critics of conspiracy theory on the old ideological left are, under the sly rubric of guarding against extremism and captivating populist myths, waging war on real truth-seeking. I have personally seen, over and over, what Parenti laments here. Those who most loudly disparage conspiracy theory are most often the ones with the least knowledge of the actual evidence being presented. A second issue which Parenti deals with here is the tired canard of a simplistic conspiracy theory versus structural and institutional analysis dichotomy, which is constantly hammered out by the left foes of conspiracy investigation, who then turn around and offer little of their preferred institutional analysis at all, instead usually engaging in typical headline chasing. Right off the bat, we are face to face with the blog owner's own critique that they share with Parenti. Conspiracy phobia has made the left essentially impotent and stupid in their quest to keep out the rabble. Academic and intellectual rigor fall by the wayside for numerous supposed critics, and they would sooner deny themselves true answers than actually pursue the lead with intellectual curiosity. It's a sad happenstance. By keeping ourselves bound to the strictest, and often CIA-sponsored, narrative, we are setting ourselves up for failure and knee-jerk reactions. Two. Almost as an article of faith, some individuals believe that conspiracies are either kooky fantasies or unimportant aberrations. To be sure, wacko conspiracy theories do exist, but it does not logically follow that all conspiracies are imaginary. Conspiracy is a legitimate concept in law, the collusion of two or more people pursuing illegal means to effect some illegal or immoral end. People go to jail for committing conspiratorial acts. Conspiracies are a matter of public record, and some are of real political significance. The Watergate break-in was a conspiracy, as was the Watergate cover-up, which led to Nixon's downfall. Iran-Contra was a conspiracy of immense scope. Much of it is still uncovered. Often the term conspiracy is applied dismissively whenever one suggests that people who occupy positions of political and economic power are consciously dedicated to advancing their elite interests. It should not surprise us that conspiracy is another phrase that has been rung through the media washboard too many times and had all the dye faded out. Conspiracy, an actual criminal charge, yes, I watched Columbo, can be levied against a party when there is enough evidence to put a preliminary tack on the person for lawful misconduct. Colluding businesses trying to gouge prices is collusion and is technically illegal. But now everything is a conspiracy, as we discussed in the previous episode. If you don't have the power of the CIA to say whatever you want with executive approval, then of course anything any dude with a podcast wants to say sounds like conspiracy. But we should not be so hasty. In 1994, the officers of the Federal Reserve announced they would pursue monetary policies designed to maintain a high level of unemployment in order to safeguard against overheating the economy. When an acquaintance of mine mentioned this to his friends, he was greeted skeptically. Do you think the Fed bankers are deliberately trying to keep people unemployed? In fact, not only did he think it, it was announced on the financial pages of the press. I remarked to a participant that US leaders were pushing hard for the reinstatement of capitalism in the former communist countries. He said, "Do you really think they carry it to that level of conscious intent?" I pointed out that it was not a conjecture on my part. They have repeatedly announced their commitment to seeing that free market reforms are introduced in Eastern Europe. Their economic aid is channeled almost exclusively into the private sector. People can get real smug when they realize that they have the keys to the asylum, so to speak. When you're the crazy one for suggesting that JFK could have been taken care of by other means, people immediately jump on you and say, "What are you, some kind of tinfoil hat nut?" They like to seem smarter and more well thought out by dismissing your concerns instead of investigating themselves. Lazy and arrogant. Politically illiterate or apathetic folks will often just ignore warnings before they're implemented because, no, it can't happen here. Four. Those who suffer from conspiracy phobia are fond of saying, "Do you actually think there's a group of people sitting around in a room plotting things?" For some reason, that image is assumed to be so patently absurd as to invite only disclaimers. No one confabulates and plans more than political and corporate elites and their hired specialists. To make the world safe for those who own it, politically active elements of the owning class have created a national security state that extends billions of dollars and enlists the efforts of vast numbers of people. They are more attuned and more capable advancing their vast interests than most other social groups. The alternative is to believe that the powerful and the privileged are somnambulists, who move about oblivious to questions of power and privilege, that they always tell us the truth and have nothing to hide even when they hide so much. That although most of us ordinary people might consciously try to pursue our own interests, wealthy elites do not. That when those at the top employ force and violence around the world, it is only for the laudable reasons they profess. That when they arm, train, and finance covert actions in numerous countries, and then fail to acknowledge their role in such deeds, it is because of oversight or forgetfulness or perhaps modesty. And that it is merely a coincidence how the policies of the national security state so consistently serve the interest of the transnational corporations and the capital accumulation system throughout the world. Currently highlights the small-mindedness of the general criticism and skepticism certain conspiracies, or even conjectures, face. As we read in Cat's Not War Part 3, conspiracism used to be thought of as paranoia and delusions caused by mental illness. Nowadays, it's prompted by political nihilism, cynicism, and secrecy. Some people simply like to make fun of these theorists without ever acknowledging that if the CIA's declassified documents are literally saying something is amiss, then yeah, there's cause for concern. I think there's a degree of unwillingness to admit that we don't know everything and are helpless in the face of such deadly forces. If capitalism needs to make room for those who will further its goals, then the average citizens would think it best to let Kennedy and his assassins have that dogfight on their own inside an insulated bubble a world away from the public. Like Parenti says, the only alternative is to assume our governmental officials are so incompetent, lazy, slow, and unmotivated towards their goals that they just flat out do nothing when a challenge arises. Five. Oliver Stone's film JFK revived popular interest in the question of President John Kennedy's assassination. Conservatives and liberals closed ranks to tell people that there was no conspiracy to murder the president, for such things do not happen in the United States. Noam Chomsky, Alexander Cockburn, and others challenged the notion that Kennedy was assassinated for intending to withdraw from Vietnam or for threatening to undo the CIA or end the Cold War. Such things could not have led to his downfall, they argue, because Kennedy was a Cold Warrior, pro-CIA, and wanted a military withdrawal from Vietnam only with victory. In fact, the massive ground war ordered by Johnson and the saturation bombings of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, ordered by Nixon, represented a dramatic departure from Kennedy's policy. The evidence we have indicates that Kennedy observed Cambodian neutrality and negotiated a ceasefire and a coalition government in Laos, which the CIA refused to honor. Another example of everyone saying, "It can't happen here." It's funny how both conservatives and liberals openly protect the status quo depending on how many death knells capital has brought to this fair country. The two leftist political writers that Parenti goes on to mention are Noam Chomsky, who is one of my personal faves, so sorry for the roasting in this episode, Grandpa, and Alexander Cockburn. Both Chomsky and Cockburn deny any political motivation on the government side for having Kennedy assassinated because he was pro-Cold War. However, when comparing him to Johnson, he looks like a dove. Kennedy brings about Cold War détente, and this was the primary reason for his assassination, according to Parenti. If he had been more of an ardent war hawk and decided to throw out his attempts at peace and neutrality, he would have been spared the fate he experienced. It was JFK versus the CIA, an organization that, frankly, did not want to be under the thumb of a president who would rather we not try another Bay of Pigs and instead work on restoring equilibrium in Asia, the stronghold of communist insurgency. Six. One of Kennedy's closest aides, Kenneth O'Donnell, wrote that the president planned to withdraw from Vietnam after the 1964 elections. According to Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, who headed military support for the clandestine operations of the CIA, Kennedy dictated the rich parts of NSAM 263, calling for the withdrawal of not only all U.S. troops, but all Americans, meaning CIA officers and agents too. Prouty reflects that the president thereby signed, quote, his own death warrant, end quote. The Army newspaper Stars and Stripes ran a headline, quote, President says all Americans out by 1965, end quote. According to Prouty, quote, the Pentagon was outraged, JFK was a curse word in the corridors, end quote. And, quote, President Kennedy was determined not to let Vietnam become an American war. That is, he was determined not to send U.S. combat troops, as opposed to advisors, to fight in Vietnam nor to bomb North Vietnam, end quote. Other Kennedy aides, such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and General Maxwell Taylor, made the same point. Taylor said, quote, the last thing he, Kennedy, wanted was to put in ground forces. I don't recall anyone who was strongly against the recommendation except one man, and that was the president, end quote. Kennedy opposed the kind of escalation embarked upon soon after his death by Lyndon Johnson, who increased U.S. troops in Vietnam from 17,000 to approximately 250,000 and committed them to an all-out ground war. More evidence to suggest Kennedy had it coming. The military-industrial complex, fueled by the never-ending war a la Orwell, cannot have a presidential decree ordering every single American out of an area full of rich resources and intelligence. Stemming from the withdrawal only compounded the fact that those being withdrawn could do nothing about it, though I imagine the ground troops were probably happy beyond belief to go back home and never see Vietnam ever again. The news media had a field day and only added fuel to the fire by making Kennedy's intentions so clear to the American public, who either saw him as a lifesaver or a coward. Seven. Chomsky argues that the CIA would have had no grounds for wanting to kill JFK because he was a dedicated counterinsurgent Cold Warrior. To offer a parallel, we might be of the opinion that the New Deal did relatively little for working people and that Franklin Roosevelt actually was a tool of the very interest he publicly denounced as economic royalist. From this, we might conclude that the plutocrats had much reason to support FDR's attempts to save big business from itself, but most plutocrats damned that man in the White House as a class traitor. In fact, President Kennedy was not someone the CIA could tolerate, and the feeling was mutual. JFK told one of his top officials that he wanted, quote, to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, end quote. New York Times, April 25th, 1966. He closed the armed CIA camps that were readying for the second Bay of Pigs invasion and took a number of other steps designed to bring the agency under control. He fired its most powerful and insubordinate leaders, Director Allen Dulles, Deputy Director Charles Cable, and Deputy Director for Plans Richard Bissell. He tried to reduce its power and jurisdiction and set strict limits as to its future actions, and he appointed a high-level committee to investigate the CIA's past misdeeds. Having the correct perspective on historical events makes analysis clearer and easier. It has never been my idea that FDR himself was a tool of the upper hot bourgeois, but to some on the left, I guess he would seem that way, propping up liberal democracy with Socdem programs in order to keep the boat afloat instead of letting it capsize. Nevertheless, at the time, this was so divisive, FDR became the president with the highest amount of vetoes and executive orders in history at the time of his presidency. He used every arsenal in his toolbox to systematically skate past Congress and his plutocrat detractors, all in an effort to give the working class a break. Even though it paid off, he made many, many enemies, to speak nothing of his efforts to pack the court. Even though we consider him among the top 10 US presidents today, he wasn't so hot in his heyday with oligarchs. Kennedy, in his day and age, was a similar firebrand of infamous. He wouldn't stand for the CIA's wanton meddling and shut them down flat, earning him deadly derision. Eight. FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover hated JFK and did not believe he could be trusted with the nation's future. They referred to him as, quote, that delinquent in the White House, end quote. Roger Craig records the comments of numerous Dallas police officers who wanted to see Kennedy done away with. Several years ago, on a San Francisco talk show station, KGO, I heard a listener call in as follows, quote, "This is the first time I'm saying this. I worked for Army intelligence. In 1963, I was in Japan, and the accepted word around then was that Kennedy would be killed because he was messing with the intelligence community. When word came of his death, all I could hear was delighted comments like, "We got him." End quote. This is a really big yikes. When you have your own police, military personnel, and intelligence community talking about you like you're some terrorist insurgent from the Middle East, you're in trouble. I mean, come on, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI's chief, hated him. I don't discount the possibility that the Dallas Police Bureau somehow loosened their ranks to make it easier for something to go down on that fateful day. Several years after JFK's murder, President Johnson told White House aide Marvin Watson that he, quote, was convinced that there was a plot in connection with the assassination, end quote, and that the CIA had something to do with it. Washington Post, December 13, 1977. And Robert Kennedy repeatedly made known his suspicions that the CIA had a hand in the murder of his brother. This is pretty self-explanatory. When even JFK's own brother thinks foul play happened, you know something's fishy. Doesn't help that he too was assassinated years later. How much more obvious can you get than a standing US president openly coming out and telling a major newspaper, "Yeah, I think the CIA had something to do with Kennedy's death." JFK's enemies in the CIA, the Pentagon, and elsewhere fixed on his refusal to provide air coverage for the Bay of Pigs, his unwillingness to go into Indochina with massive ground forces, his no-invasion guarantee to Khrushchev on Cuba, his overtures for a rapprochement with Castro and professed willingness to tolerate countries with different economic systems in the Western Hemisphere, his atmospheric test ban treaty with Moscow, his American University speech calling for re-examination of U.S. Cold War attitudes toward the Soviet Union, his antitrust suit against General Electric, his curtailing of the oil depletion allowance, his fight with U.S. Steel over price increases, his challenge to the Federal Reserve Board's multi-billion-dollar monopoly control of the nation's currency, his warm reception at labor conventions, and his call for racial equality. This is a big rundown list of all of JFK's faults that could have gotten him canned. We'll never know the exact reason for his death, unless some declassified document comes to light in the future, but I'd like to think it was due to an overall lack of control. The other high-ranking US government officials knew they could only compete with JFK, but they could not control him. He was a wild card with widespread approval they couldn't tame. He was diplomacy over battalions, the modern-day equivalent of peace in the Middle East. If they couldn't get him on an impeachment charge, and I'm not sure that any fabricated ones would have stuck anyway, the Kennedy family was rich and powerful all on their own and would have yanked him out of trouble. And really, they couldn't get him to resign, so then there was only one solution, and it wasn't to wait his term limit out. Knoll said Stone's movie was a, quote, melange of fact and fiction, end quote. Progressive, March 1992. To be sure, some of the dramatization was fictionalized, but regarding the core events related to Clay Shaw's perjury, eyewitness reports at Dealey Plaza, the behavior of U.S. law officers, and other suspicious happenings, the movie remained faithful to the facts unearthed by serious investigators. The commission sat for 51 long sessions over a period of several months, much longer than most major investigations. It compiled 26 volumes of testimony and evidence. It had the investigative resources of the FBI and CIA at its disposal, along with its own professional team. It asked only a limited set of questions that seemed to assume Oswald's guilt as a lone assassin. As Mark Lane notes, there was a crying need for a seventh panel, one that would try to discover who killed President Kennedy. The commission never saw the need for that undertaking, having already made up its mind. While supposedly dedicated to bringing the truth to light, Warren Commission operated in secrecy. The minutes of its meeting were classified top secret, and hundreds of thousands of documents and other evidence were sealed for 75 years. The commission failed to call witnesses who heard and saw people shooting from behind the fence on the grassy knoll. It falsely recorded the testimony of certain witnesses, as they were to complain later on, and reinterpreted the testimony of others. In fact, the US public has been anything but gullible. Surveys show that 78% of the public say they believe there was a conspiracy. Chomsky and Cockburn are comparing the public's gullibility about miracles with its own unwillingness to be gullible about the official line that has been fed to them for 30 years. A refusal on all accounts to acknowledge the depth and breadth of strange occurrences surrounding the assassination is troublesome. At this point, it becomes flat out denial to assume that there was nothing at least suspicious surrounding Kennedy's death, if not outright foul play. The HSCA eventually admitted there was at least one more gunman, but that doesn't mean much if you believe intergovernmental figures did it. The committee sitting to discuss the issue conveniently forgot to include certain evidence, and, if you read the second footnote on the bottom of the page, a witness was murdered after the events of the killing, an immigrant named Del Valle from Cuba. Not to mention an informant was on the scene, Jack Ruby, the presumed killer of Oswald. I mean, one of the guys literally got hit with a perjury charge, which should have at least negated his credibility and testimony. And call it the nosy journalist inside me, but I think the public, at this point, should be able to obtain those once classified documents from the meetings the CIA and FBI had in reference to the assassination. Freedom of Information Act and all that jazz. I'm surprised none of the other members of the Warren Commission were ever charged with falsifying and altering testimonies at the very least. But why would participants in a conspiracy of this magnitude risk everything by maintaining an internal record, whatever that is, about the actual murder? Why would they risk their lives by going public? A good number of those who agreed to cooperate with investigators met untimely death. Chomsky is able to maintain his criticism that no credible evidence has come to light only by remaining determinedly unacquainted with the mountain of evidence that has been uncovered. There has even been a decision in a U.S. court of law, Hunt v. Liberty Lobby, in which a jury found that President Kennedy had indeed been murdered by a conspiracy involving, in part, CIA operatives E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, and FBI informant Jack Ruby. Nixon advisor H.R. Haldeman admits in his memoir, quote, "After Kennedy was killed, the CIA launched a fantastic cover-up." Quote, "In a chilling parallel to their cover-up at Watergate, the CIA literally erased any connection between Kennedy's assassination and the CIA." End quote. Like I described below, and like Parenti will describe in a minute, if Oswald was the lone gunman, there's absolutely no reason, unless, like Jack Ruby was presumed to be, he was affiliated with the mob and/or the FBI. Multiple other investigative eyewitnesses and those who gave testimonials would be dead in his wake. Internal records getting leaked actually wouldn't be the worst thing for the Warren Commission or whomever. Most of the panels, like the Oswald evidence and conviction panel, were non-existent, And by keeping all this info in their heads instead of on paper, investigators could die taking their dealings to the grave. Even if we wanted to invoke FOIA, we might not find anything sensational. In regards to Chomsky, I think he's just being stubborn on this whole thing. If he's got his finger on the pulse and doesn't even trust the courts to meter out the truth, then a US court, again, they're not always ethical and just, but the point still stands, that 3 men in the intelligence community were quite literally convicted as being part of the Kennedy murder plot. It's almost comical at this point how many upper-level execs have come forth years later and admitted as much in passing. "13. The remarkable thing about Erwin Knoll, Noam Chomsky, and Alexander Cockburn, and others on the left who attack the Kennedy conspiracy findings is they remain invincibly ignorant of the critical investigations that have been carried out. I have repeatedly pointed this out in exchange with them, and they never deny it. They have not read any of the many studies by independent researchers who implicate the CIA in a conspiracy to kill the president, and in the even more protracted and extensive conspiracy to cover up the murder. But this does not prevent them from dismissing the conspiracy charges in the most general and unsubstantiated terms. I guess we can chalk this one up to the Dunning-Kruger effect. "14. It is an either-or world for those on the left who harbor an aversion for any kind of conspiracy investigation. Either you are a structuralist in your approach to politics or a conspiracist who reduces historical developments to the machinations of secret cabals, thereby causing us to lose sight of the larger systemic forces. In most of its operations, the CIA is by definition a conspiracy, using covert actions and secret plans, many of which are of the most unsavory kind. What are covert operations if not conspiracies? At the same time, the CIA is an institution, a structural part of the national security state. In sum, the agency is an institutionalized conspiracy. Conspiracies are a component of the national security political system, not deviations from it. Ruling elites use both conspiratorial covert actions and overtly legitimating procedures at home and abroad. They finance everything from electoral campaigns and publishing houses to mobsters and death squads. They utilize every conceivable stratagem, including killing one of their own if they perceive him to be a barrier to their larger agenda of making the world safe for those who own it. In investigating the JFK conspiracy, researchers are not looking for an escape from something unpleasant and difficult, as Chomsky would have it. Rather, they are raising grave questions about the nature of state power in what is supposed to be a democracy. I think conspiracism shares the same ethos behind its judgments as leftists who gatekeep their social spaces. Only certain people are allowed, as if this is some Golden Dawn order or an after-school club. There are no qualifiers or disqualifiers to being politically active online or IRL, only that you sincerely believe in your chosen ideology and do your best work to advance it by yourself and with others. The dichotomy between the good structural analyst versus the bad conspiracist is unhelpful. It only seeks to divide us in an arbitrary manner. Why then is it so hard for those like Cockburn and Chomsky to come to grips with the fact that the organization that they are already critical of could have played a part in an assassination attempt, especially when facts are being hidden from us by classified documents? And by nature, intelligence officers are doing a job that all but institutionalizes secrecy. so I guess we can't really expect too much from them on that front. Though, in all honesty, I doubt the institution that got involved with the Contras in Nicaragua, which is another conspiracy by nature, would balk at collusion to assassinate. To give another example of conspiracy, but this time outside of the government, remember the college admission scandal? That was a conspiracy by definition. Conspiracy to insert rich people's kids into top colleges by faking exam scores and bribing admissions offices. If we do not investigate these conspiracies, we are giving the passive okay to these people to continue being shady, and that's not what democracy is supposed to encapsulate. (15) Left publications have given much attention to conspiracies such as Watergate, the FBI COINTELPRO, Iran-Contra, Iraq-Gate, CIA drugs for guns trade, BCCI, and savings and loans scandals. It is never explained why these conspiracies are important while the JFK assassination is not. G. William Domhoff points out, quote, "If conspiracy means that these ruling class men are aware of their interests, know each other personally, meet together privately and off the record, and try to hammer out a consensus on how to anticipate and react to events and issues, then there is some conspiring that goes on in CFR, the Council for Foreign Relations, not to mention the Committee for Economic Development, the Business Council, the National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency. We all have a tremendous tendency to want to get caught up in believing that there is some secret evil cause for all of the obvious ills of the world." End quote. Conspiracy theories, quote, "encourage a belief that if we get rid of a few bad people, everything will be well in the world." End quote. Peter Dale Scott responds, quote, "I believe that a true understanding of the Kennedy assassination will lead not to a few bad people, but to the institution and parapolitical arrangements which constitute the way we are systematically governed." End quote. Some of the conspiracies Parenti mentions are ones I've named and discussed in previous episodes. Fascinating hypocrisy. Left academics don't seem to understand the impact that ignoring the suspicions around JFK's assassination hold for our concept of democracy. Again, if you accept Contra, COINTEL, and Watergate, then it follows that the JFK business shouldn't be totally implausible. The fact that we may have seen, on live TV no less, the assassination of a president with the help of one of our own branches of intelligence and security means that even a person as powerful as Kennedy wasn't off the radar. What does that mean for the rest of us? You can literally invoke that yes meme to half of the charges being levied against conspiracies. Yes, conspiracies are collusions of powerful people. Yes, conspiracies are secret. Yes, conspiracies usually involve money and moving money around for the benefit of those wealthy few. Peter Dale Scott, remember him? Responds well by saying that engaging with, in his words, deep politics will enable us not to merely throw some bad apples out, but to shake the very foundation of the political industry. (16) The left's critics' hatred of Kennedy clouds their judgment about the political significance of his murder. They mistake the low political value of the victim with the high political importance of the assassination, its implications for democracy, and the way it exposes the gangster nature of the state. This is the crux of the argument. Parenti correctly asserts and identifies the problem. Leftists generally agree that Kennedy was just another tool for capitalist dominion in American politics. The grand scheme of his murder, then, should only go as far as that. Another dead Kennedy. Of course, I break with the traditional leftist position, and this is not to get too into the weeds, in that I don't think harm reduction in the face of capital's destruction is worthless, or that we must overthrow everything with speed and precision. Kennedy wanted to institute some policies and held beliefs that, in my mind, were better than what Johnson and Nixon held. They have killed their own presidents. No longer the bastion of freedom and democracy, they have exposed how similar the government is to the mafia, giving it the apt name Parenti and others have termed the gangster state. And finally, 17. The left critics psychologize about our illusions, our false dreams, our longing for messiahs and father figures, or inability to face unpleasant realities the way they can. They deliver patronizing admonitions about our conspiracy captivation and Camelot yearnings. They urge us not to escape into fantasy. They are the cognoscenti who guide us and outleft us on the JFK assassination, a subject about which they know next to nothing and whose significance they have been unable to grasp. Having never read the investigative literature, they dismiss the investigators as irrelevant or irrational. To cloak their own position with intellectual respectability, they fall back on an unpracticed structuralism. It is neither Kennedy worship nor Camelot yearnings that motivates our inquiry, but a desire to fight back against manipulative and malignant institutions so that we might begin to develop a system of accountable rule worthy of the name democracy. And before we end, I would actually like to read this second footnote because I feel that it is actually important. Del Valle's name came up the day after JFK's assassination when Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade announced at a press conference that Oswald was a member of Del Valle's anti-communist Free Cuba Committee. Wade was quickly contradicted from the audience by Jack Ruby, who claimed that Oswald was a member of the leftish Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Del Valle, who was one of several people that New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison sought out in connection with the JFK assassination, was killed the same day that David Ferrie, another suspect, met a suspicious death. When found in Miami, Del Valle's body showed evidence of having been tortured, bludgeoned, and shot. And our final note to wrap this all up: history is simply mystery. At the end of the day, it's a very human desire to want to have all the pieces lined up nicely in the spaces they should ideally occupy in our grand puzzle. Our political puzzle has many excuses to conjure up for its many misgivings, and state and academic actors do them justice by supplying strange tales and stranger explorations into the human psyche. They dive into Freudian analysis. We need a strong figure to save us. We need a parental guardian in the form of a president. We miss being subjugated, etc. Kennedy was our King Arthur and we can't stand to see him go, or so people like Chomsky say. That's why we can't be content with how things ended. But we must remember that they, too, are safeguarding against their own ignorance. If someone has escaped into apathy and derision, then their opinions cannot be taken as gospel. A desire to learn and uncover will forever be an important trait to have in a well-developed democracy. And without it, what are we but chickens running around headless? So that's all for today, and that is the end of this episode. I will see you around next time for episode 7. Take care!
2, 7, 5. 3, 8, 2, 7, 7.